Today, I write another page of Jesus' diary, my diary. Today, the wind carried no message. The sun rose, but not to greet me. It simply appeared, and I stood still, as if the earth itself held its breath. There are days when silence is peaceful, like the quiet of water before sunrise. But today, silence felt like a storm that didn't roar, a scream that never reached the air, a question sent to heaven that returned unanswered. I walked away from the towns, the faces, the voices. I left behind the warmth of company, the comfort of sound, and the safety of routine. I walked into absence, not to escape, but to find. And yet, what I found first was the absence itself. Not of people, but of him, my Father, the one whose voice once split the skies when I rose from the water. Today, he said nothing. No wind, no fire, no dove, just stillness. Not rejection, but something deeper, something more difficult. Permission to suffer. Have you ever felt like heaven was watching, but refused to speak? That was my first step into the desert. Not a place, a feeling. I was not hungry yet, not tired yet, but something inside me cracked. Before my body ever weakened, my soul bent under the weight of divine silence. If you're listening to this, if you're watching, maybe you felt it too. Maybe you've been in the place between questions and answers, between obedience and emptiness. This is for you. Like this video, if you've ever waited in silence for God to speak. Because sometimes the deepest parts of faith are written without words. In the desert, the air was dry, thick with the scent of dust and untouched soil. The desert didn't move. Not a leaf, not a shadow, just a wide, breathless stillness stretching endlessly before me. The sky above was too quiet to comfort me. Its blue was sharp, so sharp it felt like glass about to crack. The sun pressed down, not like warmth, but like judgment, the kind of heat that exposes more than it warms. The ground beneath my feet was broken and brittle, as if it, too, had not been spoken to in centuries. There were no people, no disciples, no paths, no birds, just a silence so deep, even my thoughts whispered. Each step I took stirred the dust into soft clouds around my ankles, as if the earth was remembering that someone was finally walking through it again. My footprints, they looked like wounds in the sand. The world behind me had faded. Jerusalem, the river, the faces of those I loved, they felt like another life. Another man. I was not him now. I was something undone, something still becoming. The wind tried to speak, but only stammered. I listened anyway. Inside me, the ache was louder than the desert. Not hunger, not fear, but something else. A kind of homesickness for a voice I could no longer hear. And yet, I knew I had been led here. Not by accident, not by mistake, but by purpose. A holy calling wrapped in absence. A divine invitation to feel what most avoid, the beginning of becoming empty. This was not just a place of silence. It was a silence that had a name, and it called me. He was already there when I arrived. Not a man, not a voice, but a weight, an invisible presence that clung to the silence like dust clings to sweat. I did not see him with my eyes, but I felt him, the fear, not of the devil, but of what I would become if I stayed here long enough. My greatest enemy wasn't waiting for me in the form of temptation. He was buried deep inside me, questions I dare not ask aloud, echoes from my past, memories from the carpenter's house, from laughter I missed, from eyes I loved and left. I sat on a rock as still as the wind and felt it all press in. The ache of responsibility, the weight of knowing what I came to do and how far I had to go. But what if I got it wrong? What if this silence wasn't divine, but distance? What if the voice I heard at the river was the last one I'd hear? That's when the real battle began, not with Satan, but with my own silence. The silence that questioned, the silence that whispered. What if he doesn't speak again? It didn't shout. It didn't argue. It simply sat beside me and waited. That's when I knew. The desert does not test your strength. It tests your certainty. And for the first time, I wasn't sure what would break first, my body or my belief. I closed my eyes, not to rest, but to listen. And in that darkness behind my eyelids, the silence grew louder until it was no longer just silence. It became memory. It became prophecy. It became weight. Suddenly, I wasn't just in the desert. I was in every room I had ever left, every place I had walked away from, every face that had smiled at me before I chose this path, every laugh I would never hear again. I saw Mary's hands, those same hands that once wiped my forehead when the fever came, still carrying water the way she did when I was a child. She looked tired but strong, always strong. I saw Joseph's old bench, untouched, covered in dust, yet sacred. The hammer lay silent on the wood, as if waiting for a hand that would never return. No one would ever know the prayers he whispered between the nails. No one but me. I saw the hills of Galilee painted in dusk. I remember the feeling of running through them with nothing but wind and wonder in my chest. I remembered the day I knew, truly knew, that I was not only a son of man, but something more, and how heavy that more suddenly felt. And I wept, not from fear, not from hunger, but from the ache of surrender. Because before a man can carry a cross, he must first carry silence. And silence, true silence, is heavier than wood. The first tear did not fall down my cheek. It fell inside me, a silent rupture, a soft but irreversible breaking, not of bone or body, but of the last threads that tied me to the ordinary. There, in the wilderness, I began to disappear, not into darkness, but into calling, into fire, into something the world would not understand, but would never forget. Because the path of the Messiah does not begin in power. It begins in loss. My body had not yet fasted, but my soul had begun to empty. And in that emptiness, I felt the nearness of something unspoken. Not a voice, not yet, but a presence. The kind you don't hear, the kind you don't see, the kind that wraps around you like air. Too close to notice, too holy to hold. It didn't comfort me. It didn't answer the 1,000 questions I never dared speak aloud. But it stayed, and that was enough. Because maybe love isn't always loud. Maybe, sometimes, love is the silence that refuses to leave. Maybe God doesn't shout because he's closer than our breath. Maybe the pause is sacred. I stood up, slowly, not because the burden had vanished, but because I was now ready to carry it for them, for the broken, for the tired, for the ones who would one day scream my name, and the ones who would spit on it. This is how the desert begins. Not with a serpent, not with a stone, but with surrender, with a soul that chooses to stay present when even heaven stays quiet. If you've ever wept without knowing why, if you've ever loved God through clenched fists and unanswered prayers, if you've ever stood still when all you wanted was to run, then you understand this place. You've felt this desert. And if this page from my diary reached the dry places in your soul, subscribe, not just to this channel, but to the story of your own becoming. Because some stories aren't told with shouts. They're written with tears. And this is one of them. That day, I learned something not written in the scrolls. Something no prophet had explained. Something that cannot be taught, only lived. I learned that silence is not absence. That when heaven grows quiet, it doesn't mean heaven has turned away. It means heaven is trusting you. Trusting that you will still walk when the road disappears beneath your feet. Sometimes, love removes its voice so we can find our own. Sometimes, the Father withdraws his whisper not to punish us, but to invite us deeper, to show us that what lives inside us was placed there long before the silence ever began. Faith is not built on answers. It's not held together by explanations or proof. Faith is built on presence, especially when that presence is invisible. It is built in the ache, in the in-between, in the space where every prayer feels unanswered, but somehow you still kneel. The first lesson of the desert is not how to resist temptation. That will come. The enemy will speak, but not yet. Before the battle comes the pause. Before the temptation comes the test of staying, of remaining when you hear nothing, of believing the promise when all you feel is the pause, of choosing to stand, not because the ground is steady, but because your soul is. And on that first day, before my stomach ached, before my lips cracked with thirst, before Satan even whispered, I was taught the kind of strength that doesn't roar. It doesn't shine. It doesn't demand to be seen. It simply endures. It waits. It believes. And maybe that is where love truly begins. Not in miracles, not in power, but in a soul that chooses to stay, even when God seems silent. Today, I did not perform a miracle. I did not speak in parables. I did not heal a body or calm a storm. Today, I simply stayed. I stayed in the silence. I stayed in the ache. I stayed in the question. And that was enough, because love is not proven in noise. It's proven in the stillness between the cries, in the shadows before the sunrise. Today, I did not hear my Father's voice, but I chose to trust that He was listening anyway. And perhaps that trust was my first offering, not to the world, but to the silence itself. So I wrote, not with ink, but with tears. I etched this page not on paper, but within the silence that held me. If someone someday reads this, if these words ever leave this desert and find your heart, then know, this was not just a day of silence. It was a beginning, not of power, but of surrender. Now I ask you, have you ever walked through silence that felt like abandonment and still chose to believe? Tell me what your desert looked like. Tell me where heaven stayed quiet, but your heart stayed faithful. I said nothing. I let that moment become a word in my Jesus diary. And if someone ever hears these words, they'll know this was another day in my Jesus diary. If this page from my diary touched something deep inside you, share it. Not for numbers, not for views, but for someone else who's walking through their own silence right now. Sometimes we think we're alone in the desert, but your story might be the echo someone needs to keep believing. And if your heart is still hungry, there's another word waiting. Right there on the screen, a new moment, a new page. Click it, watch it, let's speak. Not because I said so, but because maybe He still is.